First of all, thank you everybody for participating. I had a suspicion that this was going to be a well-attended event, and it looks like people are still kind of coming in here, but it looks like a good crowd out there. So first of all, thank you very much for showing up and participating in this with us, because I think there's a lot of topics that are talked about nationally and at the state level, and in the wake of 2020 and everything else that's been going on recently in the political scene. But election integrity is obviously one of the most hot topics, if you will. Obviously, the 2020 election is part of that, but also the election reform movements, frankly, on both ideological ends of the spectrum. On the left, the move to expand voting and change the voting system in certain ways, and on the right, to protect integrity and do a lot of other things. It seems like in every state there are almost twin pathways that are being proposed to try to deal with and change and reform and perhaps even improve our voting system. And unfortunately, because of that, anytime politics gets involved in a situation like this, I think that a lot of truth can be lost and a lot of perspective can be lost on the larger dialogue we should be having about not only voter integrity, but voting systems and what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. So here today, we wanted to have a discussion and a conversation about a few different perspectives on election integrity and voting systems. A national perspective, a perspective that relates to what's been going on in the state of Georgia and how it also relates to a lot what's going on in several other states as well. And then also what happens here in Maine and how Maine's law interacts with the federal government and what our system looks like compared to others. So we brought in a panel of luminaries to help you out with this and have a really good discussion. The format for today is going to be pretty simple. I'm going to be going around our three panelists one by one to kind of get their thoughts on their particular area, on what they're planning to talk about today. We'll probably get 5 to 10 minutes from each of them. We'll do some questions from me to them to kind of follow up and have them interact a little bit with each other. And then we'll open up the floor towards the tail end of the program here today to you, the listening audience, to actually ask a question of your own if we have an opportunity to do that. So should be a good discussion. Lots of great information going to be coming your way, and I think hopefully should be channeling us in a very productive direction as it relates to actually asking ourselves the question of what our elections should look like and how we should be building our systems. So to introduce to you today our three panelists, first up is going to be Anthony Marcum. He's resident fellow at the R Street Institute, where he focuses on the federal judiciary and separation of powers disputes. He's the co-author of the R Street Institute's recent publication, A Primer on H.R. 1, the For the People Act of 2021. He's written for both scholarly and journalistic publications, including the Washington Post, Politico, USA Today, and NBC Think. He's an adjunct professor at George Washington University's Graduate School of Political Management and is an associate editor of the American Bar Association's Litigation Journal. Anthony holds a bachelor's degree from Ohio State University and a JD from Rutgers Law School, as well as a Master's of Laws from Georgetown University Law Center. So thank you very much to Anthony for participating today. We're also joined by the Honorable Buzz Brockway, who is the Executive Vice President of Public Policy with the Georgia Center for Opportunity, which is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization, looks a lot like us, based in Atlanta, with a mission to remove barriers to ensure that every person has access to a quality education, fulfilling work, and a healthy family life. Before arriving at GCO, he served 8 years in the Georgia House of Representatives, where he worked on legislation to fight human trafficking, reform election law, which is obviously pertinent today, as well as protect student data privacy and provide additional funding for charter schools. He's served as an operations manager in the plastics and manufacturing industry for over 20 years, and while in the legislature, ran a small business. And finally, but certainly not least, we're also joined by the Honorable Bill Diamond, who represents District 26th in the Maine State Senate, comprising the towns of Baldwin, Casco, Fry Island, Raymond, Standish, and Windham. He was first elected to the Maine House in 1976 and has served 16 non-consecutive terms in the Maine Senate since 1982. And he served as Secretary of State from 1989 to 1997, which is, I think, particularly important for the conversation we're going to be having today. He currently chairs the Committee on Transportation, and Senator Diamond has worked as a teacher, principal, and superintendent of schools in both the Windham and the Raymond school systems for 20 years, and has also been a small business owner for over 40. So we're very pleased to have these three gentlemen with us today to help us break down this topic. So thanks everybody for participating. Anthony, I'd like to start with you, and I know I already set this up here, but if you could give us maybe 5 or 10 minutes on your perspective about what's going on the federal level. In Congress right now, obviously there is a big debate over elections and election reform, and specifically about H.R. 1, which I know that you have a great deal of perspective on yourself. I'm most interested in learning what this bill actually does, maybe some of the rhetoric that you hear about it, what it does and doesn't do, what's accurate, what's not accurate. Give us a breakdown of what this proposal is and how it actually interacts with the larger debate we're having over election reform. Anthony?
Sure. Well, thank you, Matt, for that. And I want to thank you all for the invitation today to talk about H.R. 1. Elections and election policy in general is an incredibly important topic. In my mind, it really is the key to our democracy. And elections faced a number of challenges. Over the past year, COVID-19 challenged how states could administer their elections in a safe but effective way. That was no easy feat, especially early in the pandemic and the primary season. During the fall, there were a number of challenges and complications and legal battles contesting changes to rules, who had authority to make what decisions. And of course, interests in election reform and election administration didn't stop after Inauguration Day. And a primary legislative focus now among the Democratic majority in Congress has been focused on this topic. And it has really pivoted towards a piece of legislation, that's H.R. 1. So that was a bill that was originally introduced in 2019, and it was again introduced at the beginning of this Congress. So what is H.R. 1? What does it do? What does it not do? So to begin, H.R. 1 is a big bill. It's about 800 pages. And although when we're talking about H.R. 1, it's often shorthand to call it an elections reform bill, it's actually much larger than that. The bill's proponents would tell you that as well. When it was first introduced, it was really called a transformational suite of reforms. That's because it covers more than elections. It also dives into issues on campaign finance and ethics rules. And so my colleague, Jonathan Bidlack, and I, we tried to go through H.R. 1 and offer really a 30,000-foot perspective of the bill. We wrote the primer that Matt, you mentioned in your introduction, explaining just a few of our worries. And we really came away with three immediate concerns. We argued that it federalized elections unnecessarily. It placed federal courts into an unnecessary and probably unconstitutional spotlight, and it curtailed really crucial speech and association rights. But let's start with the big one. Let's talk about elections. So why do we say H.R. 1 federalizes elections unnecessarily? Well, let's start with the Constitution. We have the Elections Clause, and that gives the times, places, and manner of elections shall be prescribed by states. However, Congress does have an important role. Congress can make or alter such regulations, so we have a balance. And the Supreme Court in the past has observed that this really sprang from the framers' aversion to concentrated power. The problem with H.R. 1 is that it really concentrates power far too much to the federal government, to what we argue to the detriment of states and local governments. And it does this primarily by setting a minimum number of requirements for states to abide by when they're administering their own elections. And these are just a few examples, and these are surely not exhaustive. But for example, it would mandate automatic voter registration. So what this does is takes information from state agencies and forwards it to state election officials. Under federal current law, this was more of an opt-in option. An opt-in option. Really, this would be more of an opt-out option now. What else it would do? It would mandate nationwide same-day registration, allow people to change their names and addresses on election day. It would mandate for congressional redistricting purposes that each state create an independent redistricting commission, dictating the size of the commission, which 15 under H.R. 1, and the specific criteria that the commission must use when determining congressional lines. And to be fair, a lot of states do this already. And some of these ideas siloed are probably not bad ideas. The problem is that H.R. 1 is creating universal rules to implement these things without thought for state law, state challenges, and state resources, or unique state geography. And when we're talking about the bill's mandates, we have to remember that this is only applying to federal elections. States could choose not to adopt these requirements for state and local elections, whether that's due to cost, capacity, or just political scheming. Some states may choose to bifurcate these policies, which could also confuse voters and really upend the entire process. So there are legitimate reasons why states would struggle to implement many of these new rules. First of all, they're expensive. states aren't going to be getting the necessary funding to implement these changes. Sometimes the laws are even contradictory. The law requires new standards, for instance, for voting machines that are both paper-backed and have new certifiable standards. Unfortunately, we know from reporting a lot of this won't be in heavy circulation until well into 2025, although the deadline under H.R. 1 is well before that. Another instance I mentioned earlier, the automatic voter registration. Under H.R. 1, that must be up and running by 2023. But states that have already tried automatic voter registration, we've learned a few lessons. To do it properly, it really takes time and money. Rushing through this process can lead to things like registering ineligible voters, eligible voters being registered incorrectly, and potential security vulnerabilities where people's most sensitive data could be taken. And states should really be focused and should be thinking about these things. As I mentioned at the beginning, American elections are largely decentralized, and this is for good reason. Just for one, local elections inspire local participation. Elections rely on volunteers to train and spend long hours before elections and working at poll centers. And providing local governments enough political autonomy to respond to local challenges is a feature, I think, not a bug. It allows local governments to innovate, to try different election practices, some which may be copied by other states, and some maybe we'll learn later down the road should be abandoned. And this also, in the end, makes local governments directly responsible and accountable for their elections. One example I always think of is Florida. Florida infamously struggled during the 2000 presidential election. We remember the delays. Thinking back to the last election here in 2020, Florida is one of the fastest states to get results. The process was praised, and a lot of this is because Florida lawmakers and Florida policymakers were directly scrutinized and had that power and had that autonomy to be flexible and to make changes that suited their state. Another example, I think the COVID-19 crisis provides another example of why decentralized elections and decentralized election policy as a whole is preferable to a large-scale, more federalized approach. Especially in the early months of the pandemic, different regions of the country faced different challenges. States with older populations and more urban areas undoubtedly faced different challenges and considerations than other pockets of the country. So as a result, states applied a variety of strategies to prepare for 2020. This flexibility would have been near impossible in a more federalized election system, yet that's what H.R. 1 would have effectively mandated. And I also just want to make this observation. Those who encourage more federal directives and federal minimums into local elections, should take pause, especially those if you're apt to criticize past presidential administrations for misusing federal agencies and regulations for partisan advantage or to retaliate against political foes. Just fundamentally, it's not a good idea to hand the keys to election policy to the very same people whose political futures rely on that election policy to stay in power. And of course, in our paper, we make, and we might turn to this later today, other concerns about how it puts the federal courts in an awkward corner. There are serious and constitutional concerns about speech and association rights and some of the ethics rules that are in H.R. 1. But I'll kind of close with this, the current status. What is the status of H.R. 1? Well, it passed the House not too long ago, a few weeks ago in March, on essentially strictly partisan lines. I believe there was one Democratic member of Congress that voted against H.R. 1. There's a Senate companion called S1 that was introduced last month in the Senate. And really, this is probably as far as the law is going to go in Congress. There is no Republican support. So in the Senate, we have the obstacle of the filibuster. And even assuming Democrats could end the filibuster to pass it, which I think is going to be unlikely because we have 2 Democratic senators on the record that oppose ending the filibuster for any reason. And there's at least one Democrat, Senator Joe Manchin from West Virginia, that is seemingly reportedly uncomfortable with a lot of the suite of the H.R. 1 reforms. So what's possible? Well, because H.R. 1 is unlikely to become law, there's possible a skinnier version of the bill. Maybe taking a few of these possible reforms might push through later in the Congress. I think this is something to watch. It'd be interesting to see what provisions, if any, Republicans support. But for now, the law, H.R. 1, is effectively stalled, although, of course, the debate on this is unlikely to go anywhere.
Great. So there's your opening shot. Again, if you have questions, go ahead and go into the chat, and we will try to get to anybody that's in there, and we'll also open it up to the floor and hopefully get a chance to have you guys ask a question for real through the Zoom meeting itself. So either one is totally acceptable. And you also sent in a bunch of questions prior to the event here today, some of which I'll ask just to get the ball rolling once we're done with all the presentations here. So with all that said, let's move on to the question of Georgia, because I don't think any topic has been more topical recently than what's going on in Georgia with electoral reform, with the decision by Major League Baseball to pull out of the state of Georgia for its All-Star game, being the latest example of corporations getting themselves involved in this situation and taking their own stand on the issue. Clearly something to talk about and is part of the story here. So Buzz is with us here to tell us a little bit more about exactly what has recently happened in Georgia. And actually, Buzz, if you don't mind, I'd love it if you'd also detail for us a little bit what happened in Georgia before this. In other words, how long has Georgia had the laws that it already had? What did it already look like? How has it changed recently? And again, a little fact or fiction about what you're seeing maybe reported in the media and talked about by political pundits versus what's actually going on in the state itself. Buzz.
Yeah, thanks very much. And then thanks for the invitation and for the opportunity to talk. Greetings from Georgia. I know some parts of the state are having snow. We haven't, thankfully, but it's kind of chilly for us for April. Yeah, there's been a lot going on in Georgia in recent years. And really, I think what we're seeing now, it's been building for a while. Of course, we all recall the 2016 presidential election. Hillary Clinton called into question the results nationally. There were concerns over Russian interference, etc. In 2018, we had an election for governor, and it was it wasn't that it was closer than maybe it had been in Georgia in a number of years. And Georgia's a state that had been red for a long time and was now trending toward purple. And so Stacey Abrams was the Democratic nominee, who's now a national figure. I understand she just got nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize, but she's become a national figure on the backs of her loss to Brian Kemp, our current governor. She made all sorts of allegations, and none of them have really held up in court. But nevertheless, that's kind of the second election that we've had, and where the results were called into question and doubt was sowed. And then, of course, we had the 2020 election. And Georgia, I think President Trump obviously did not win Georgia. It was the first time a Republican presidential candidate had lost Georgia since 1996, when Bill Clinton won Georgia. So obviously, President Trump had a lot of questions and had a lot of concerns about things that happened in Georgia, caused a big uproar. And so what we've really had in Georgia is 3 elections in a row where people on the losing side of the election had called into question the results and made allegations. So we have that backdrop going on. In addition, in Georgia, the 2020 election was the first time we had purchased new voting machines. We had had some old ones that were purchased in 2000, and so it had been 20 years. Those machines were breaking down across the state and causing problems, so we bought some new voting machines. So this was the first big election where those were being put into place. They're ballot marking device machines where you walk up to a touch screen, make your selections, and it prints out a piece of paper that you can inspect and then feed into a scanner that counts it. So we had that, the complexity around installing a new voting system. And then, of course, the pandemic. And our Secretary of State made the decision back last spring, in the middle of the pandemic, that we needed to send Georgia's not a vote by mail state. I know a few states are. Georgia's not one of those states. But the decision was made by our Secretary of State to send all registered voters, even inactive voters, an absentee ballot application. So millions of people voted absentee that had never voted absentee before. And so you had a system, an absentee ballot system, that was used to handling about 5% of votes being cast, handling 26% of votes cast in the general election. So you probably had an absentee ballot system that was swamped. So that's kind of the backdrop of what's been going on in Georgia on elections. So if you'd set aside the presidential election, the close in nature of the presidential election, with the pandemic, with the new voting machines, it would be reasonable to expect that there would be a bill, the legislation brought forward to make some tweaks to the law and make some procedural changes in how things were done. That would be reasonable to expect. And a lot of the Senate Bill 202, which is the bill that passed into law and has caused a lot of controversy, a lot of that bill, it's 98 pages long, which, you know, it isn't close to the 800 pages that the feds are dealing with, but for a state legislature, that's a pretty big bill. So you got a 98-page bill that includes a lot of things that really, under normal circumstances, would not cause any controversy at all. But there were a few items that did cause controversy. And I'll mention a couple of them because they became the subject of a U.S. Senate hearing yesterday, which was amazingly called Jim Crow 2021. So, you know, talking about setting the expectations of what the discussion was going to be like, that's what they did. Stacey Abrams was there, as well as State Representative Jan Jones, who is our Speaker Pro Tem in the House of Representatives. But a couple of the controversial aspects of the bill are as follows. Number one, on absentee ballots, Georgia had previously used a signature match system. So you would sign your absentee ballot application. When you receive it, you would then sign your absentee ballot, and they would attempt to match that signature with the signature they had on file. It's normally the signature that's on your driver's license. There was some controversy around that. There had been a history of quite a few ballots being thrown out because of a suspicion that the signature didn't match. Voters had an opportunity to cure that, of course, but that was a problem. Georgia elected to go away from that and go toward asking people to fill out perhaps their driver's license number, that'd be the most common, or it could be the number that's on a handful of other government-issued identification form IDs, such as a military identification or even tribal identification, and a handful of other identifications. So they've gone away from the signature match and moved to using a form of ID and the number on that ID. Democrats have raised concerns over that because there are people out there who don't have a form of identification. However, the bill would allow also a person, if they don't have any of the acceptable forms of ID, they could use the last 4 digits of their Social Security number. In addition, Georgia offers free state IDs that anybody can obtain. So, you know, perhaps what needs to happen is the Secretary of State's office needs to be proactive in making sure that every voter has one of these IDs. But then, nevertheless, that's a form of controversy. One that you probably all heard about was banning food and water from the polling place. So what's been happening in Georgia in recent years, and in fact, there's a few cases that have been turned over to our state's attorney general. Georgia has long had a provision, and I think maybe every state has a provision like this. There's an expectation that there's a buffer zone around a polling place where campaigning cannot take place, where items of value cannot be given to potential voters. And there's been some abuses of that, some alleged abuses, I should say, of that. We had a state house candidate who was handing out pizza to voters in his voting area. There were activist groups such as Planned Parenthood who were handing out water that had, you know, Planned Parenthood logo on it and saying vote pro-choice and those sorts of things. So there have been some abuses of this, allegedly. And so, and in the 2020 election, it even went so far, there were food trucks, there were DJs, all sorts of stuff around polling places, handing out free food and things of value to voters. So in an effort to clear this up, what Georgia said is nobody can distribute, adding to the list of things that you cannot provide to people standing in line, they added food and water. Now, that's a buffer zone of 150 feet from the polling place. So you can have a food truck, you can do all these sorts of things outside of 150 feet, but inside of it, they don't want that to happen. But poll managers and poll workers can provide water and food and et cetera to voters if they want. But obviously that's caused controversy. Republicans probably should have done a better job messaging this and other aspects of the bill to try to better explain what's going on going into before the vote, and instead of allowing the opponents of the bill to to define it afterward. Maybe one other controversial part I'll mention that's kind of made some national news. The way things work in Georgia, the Secretary of State is responsible for administering the election, but really most of the work, and this is probably true in Maine and other states as well, most of the work is done by local elections officials. And the Secretary of State in Georgia does not have a lot of recourse. If the local elections officials are behaving badly or not complying with the law, he's kind of limited in what the Secretary of State can do. So this bill kind of took some of that authority away from local boards of education and rested it with the state boards of election, I should say. Sorry, took it away from the local state boards of election and placed it with the state board of election, and that includes the ability to remove local elections officials if they are found to have violated 3 state or federal laws or 3 state board of elections policies after an investigation has been conducted. So it's been kind of portrayed in the media that this was a massive power grab, but it really is just, in my opinion, a protection to make sure that local elections officials are following the law and administering the elections fairly. So, I think, the bill is not nearly as bad as has been portrayed in the media. Obviously, as I mentioned, there's some things that are controversial and we can debate, but on the whole, it's not going to have the dire negative impacts that I think some of the opponents have had. But then on the flip side, if you are a supporter of President Trump who thought the election was stolen, I don't see anything in this bill that would have changed the outcome of the election one way or another in the state of Georgia. I think it would have been different rules if this had been in place. Obviously, there would have been different rules, and there might have been different ways that people chose to vote. But I think the outcome would have been the same. So, both sides can take some things from this, and the political battle will continue on. And as was mentioned, Atlanta lost the MLB All-Star game, and there may be some other. Will Smith is not going to film a movie here that he would have otherwise filmed in the state of Georgia. So there has been some economic impact to this, but the destruction of Georgia, as predicted by some, has not happened yet. So we'll see how it moves on from there. So I guess one other thing I should mention is that things are in the South are different. We do have a legacy and a history of laws, of Jim Crow laws, of laws being used, absolutely being used and crafted for the sole purpose of disenfranchising, specifically African Americans. That there is that history in the state of Georgia, and as such, there are aspects of the Voting Rights Act that apply to Georgia that don't apply to other states. That also is part of the backdrop of this, and why many people are immediately suspicious when Republicans begin introducing laws around elections. So that is part of the fabric here, and that's part of as I mentioned, if I could fault Republicans for anything, I think these are not the kind of bills, knowing all of this that had gone on in Georgia, knowing the history that we have in the state of Georgia, you have to be incredibly careful when you talk about these issues and when these bills. And you have to do a lot of work. You have to do a lot of outreach and a lot of listening and a lot of talking to people to help people understand what the intent and purpose of your legislation is. So I think that's probably enough for now, and I'll be happy to answer questions as things move forward.
And I'm sure there will be plenty to come in. So
Yep.
before we get to those questions, though, we have one further thing to hear about, which is how this all relates to Maine and what Maine looks like. Bill Diamond is joining us to talk a little bit about that. He has great experience, as I mentioned before, as a former Secretary of State, and knows our election laws pretty well, I would say. Bill, I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about how Maine's laws look. I mean, how is it that Maine operates elections? And I think many of us actually, myself included, actually think that Maine's laws are pretty good. There's a couple things I would certainly do to change them to make them, I think, a little bit better. But they do a lot of things right in a lot of ways. And I'm curious to see how Maine compares to a place like Georgia or some other states out there. And then also on top of that, how, as a Secretary of State, Maine election law sort of interacts with and deals with what the federal government does for rulemaking, and how it might in fact interact with the HR1 proposal, for instance, if that does ultimately get passed. Bill, your thoughts? Bill, I think you're still on mute. Make sure you unmute yourself first.
I thought I was being taken off like I was put on. So here I am. Thank you very much, Matt. And it's been very interesting listening to Anthony and Buzz. I've spent a little time on those issues, but not a lot. So anyway, thank you for that, and thanks for inviting me. This is an occasion that I like for a couple of reasons. One, I get a chance to brag about Maine. Maine's elections and election process, I think, we're very, very unique. We always, in presidential elections, we always end up with a voter turnout, usually, well, not always, but almost always in the top 5 in the country of voting turnout. And we always measure our voting percentages on voting age population, VAP, not registered voters. So, for example, in this last election, in 2020, we had a 78% turnout. That wasn't 78% of registered voters. That was 78% of voting age population. So we take extra pride in that. We usually compete with Minnesota and a couple other states and go back and forth. But anyway, that makes us, I think we consider ourselves unique, whether it's a Democrat or Republican Secretary of State. We seem to have a tradition in our state that once you get that position, you become a nonpartisan administrator and chief election official for the state. And that carries with it a lot of responsibility. And it's something that all of us who have been secretaries, we take that very, very seriously. And it's something that we and others take seriously as well. And we don't have to worry about becoming accused of being partisan, because none of us play that way while in that role. Let me explain some of the things that Maine does. And Matt asked to point out some things that are maybe a little different here in Maine. When I was secretary, and some of these things are still going on, especially our pride in our local elections, the clerks and the wardens run local elections. And whether it's a presidential or just a state election, wherever it may be, it's the locals that handle this. Now, if they have a problem or they get in a situation where they need some advice, they'll call the Secretary of State. And if there's a real problem, then the Secretary, unlike Georgia evidently, will get involved in this whole process and try to solve the problems if we can. So I guess I would add a little bit more of a down-home touch to this. The wardens really, that's probably a good name, because they take their job extremely seriously. So during election day, the wardens are the ones that make the decision. They will tell you whether or not you're following state election laws, and they will do that with a great deal of pride and aggression if necessary. Also in Maine, we have paper ballots or online is something we don't deal with. So we don't have to worry about somebody tapping in and making changes and doing the kind of things we heard from around the state that happened in some states. So that's one of the areas that we really take pride in. And if there's a recount necessary, whether it's a statewide, a region, a congressional, or maybe a state senate, a state house race, that is all handled eventually by the Secretary of State. But prior to that, it's handled locally. And we have a law that allows an inspection of the ballots. And oftentimes candidates, if it's a close election, they will use that law to say, look, let me just inspect the ballots. What they're really doing is doing a recount. And if there's some concern, then they will actually ask and apply for an official recount through the Secretary of State. We've always been open and encouraging to get out the vote. When I was secretary, I implemented many things, and some of them are still in existence. For example, in Maine, back before it became a political issue, homeless people, I was concerned that some of them obviously wanted to vote, but in Maine, you have to have you have to be able to register a residence where you live. And so what I did is I allowed a park bench to be a resident. And so the homeless people could vote. Now, we didn't have a big turnout of homeless people, but we had some that wouldn't have voted otherwise. And that was considered to be a fair thing to do. It wasn't, we weren't nearly as highly political as we are now and divided as we are now. But that's the kind of thing that it really encouraged people, even the non-homeless, to say, you know what, we do have pride in what we do in the state of Maine, and we reach out to people because we want people involved. I even would go to McDonald's at the pickup window, and I would hand out voter registration cards. And that was something that, of course, it got some press, but it really did, come election time, it highlighted the importance of people getting involved and voting. So I did that a number of times, mostly for the promotion of the election day that was coming up, but also to actually we got folks registered. Also, in Maine, we have a little unique area where the Secretary of State is in charge of motor vehicles. So that's a big part of the job, frankly. But in that, when it comes to voting, I was able to implement motor voter. And what that basically was is very simple. It just allowed people going into the motor vehicle division and the various satellite offices, and they could register to vote, take a card and register it and drop it off there, and we would get it to the appropriate community for them. Another couple of unique things we had Rock the Vote, which was a national program, but we got Maine involved with it because that allowed the younger generation, the younger people who were not voting. I mean, 18 to 26 was back a few years, and I suspect it's still the same, was not a good percentage of turnout. So we got Rock the Vote going, and we had these major rock groups around the country. We participated in and they would get involved in the Maine elections just simply by encouraging the young people to vote. So we've always had same day registration. So if you wanted to vote and you didn't think of it till the last day, we've always had that. And I think all of these things have held up our banner that we are proud. We value people getting involved. We try to keep all of this as non-partisan as possible. That is, with those who are running it, whether you're a warden, a clerk, or even Secretary of State. So Maine is also, I think, as we proved in the last election, like our elected officials, to think independently, notwithstanding whatever party they may be enrolled in and running under. I think we showed that again this time with Senator Collins. An unbelievable amount of money that was spent on both sides, but at the end of that election, some of us didn't even recognize who Senator Collins was, but she walks away with almost a 10-point win. And I think that showed she's always been an independent thinker, an actor, and to the chagrin of some Republicans, certainly. But in terms of Maine, we like that independent thought. And all of that comes together under our voting laws that we now have on the books. We do have some laws some bills that are being proposed, which may or may not make it. I'm concerned about a couple of them, but a lot of them deal with absentee voting and changing the laws around that. But I think I've taken up probably the 10 minutes I'm supposed to take. But I just want to highlight again that we really in Maine are unique in many ways, as I've pointed out, and we look forward to sharing some of the things which we've done, some of our successes with other states, because I think they've proven to be good. So I'll stop right there and happy to answer any questions. And thank you, Matt, again for having me. Yeah, gee,
I'm muted. Look at this.
There you go.
Jeez. Thank you, Bill. Appreciate it. As always, it could talk to you. And thanks so much for participating to all three of you on our panel here. Obviously, now we're going to open it up to questions. We have about probably 15 or 16 minutes left to get to some of those. A lot of them were submitted prior to the event, so I've got a couple here that I think I'll kick things off with, as well as some have made their way into the chat as well, and keep that up. Actually, Bill, if I could stay with you for a second, I saw Stephanie Anderson had a question about the voting tabulation machines and whether or not they're connected to the internet. I don't know, Stephanie, if you're with us, if you can unmute, you can ask your question to Bill yourself. Stephanie, are you out there?
Yes. Hi,
Hi,
Senator Diamond.
Oh, Stephanie, nice to see you. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, it's been a long time. Yeah. Okay. So, all right. Yeah, my question was, and I was just typing in a second question actually, and I don't know what the right word for the voting machines are, if they're called tabulators or whatever, but are they connected at all to the internet? And secondly, are they accessible through the internet? Like, how safe are they from hacking?
Now, no and no. That's
Okay.
one of the good things we talk about. They are more of a tabulation. And so what happens, sometimes they break down, by the way, and they have to be attended to individually. Like there's no central database that goes with all this. So the beauty of Maine is, again, we have paper ballots. They're put through the tabulating machine, numbers are recorded. And then if we go to ranked choice voting, which is another whole thing I didn't even get into, but if we have to go that route, then we have to rent these ungodly expensive computers to do that counting, because again, it doesn't go to a central location data. So it makes us quite protected, I think, and it's something that we take great pride in.
Yeah, and if I can just hang on to the
follow up, sure, go ahead.
One thing you didn't, I have a point and then a question. One thing you didn't mention, Senator Diamond, was the fact that Maine allows inmates to vote, which I've always appreciated, actually. So that's another way in which Maine has very liberal voting laws. My second question is this: what are the chances of LD 1083, which requires a photo ID to vote? And if you don't have a photo ID, the Secretary of State will give you one free of charge. I know it came out of committee divided.
Right.
I don't understand why people don't see that if people had to vote with a photographic ID, it would assuage concerns about voter integrity. And so is there any chance of that bill passing?
There's always a chance, but I have to say that this didn't really come up out of the dust until more recent years. It was never raised before, and I think that comes with a lot of the things that are happening now on the very divisive partisan part. But the answer to your question, Stephanie, is it certainly could. I think it's got caught into the highly partisan, again, realm, where it's going to be very difficult for this bill to get a lot of traction. Although having said that, we haven't been together as a legislature like we ordinarily are, and I could get a better sense by walking the halls, but we don't have any of that now. So I would say probably whatever I'm talking about is a mere guess, but from just what's happening now politically, it probably is going to face some uphill battle.
Hmm.
If I could go to Anthony, and this is one of the ones that's come in via email prior to the event today. There was a question about HR 1 and how it would change the way federal elections results are able to be contested in court. Basically, the question boils down to asking what the bill would actually be proposing and the impact of what the bill would be on the federal judiciary as it relates to these types of challenges. And I think challenges to elections are certainly on everybody's mind after 2020. So your thoughts on that, Anthony?
So HR 1 has a couple or a few implications for the federal courts, and I'll try to go over a couple. One which that concerns me is that there's actually a provision in HR 1. If you have a constitutional challenge to the bill, it actually limits the form where you can bring that challenge. So let's say there's someone who wants to bring a challenge who lives in Maine. More likely than not, how HR 1 is currently written, and of course it's flexible, it may change in the Senate version, you know, and as I argued earlier, it's kind of stalled, so I don't know if the language is going to change, but you would probably have to file that in DC District Court. So even if you live in Portland, you couldn't go down the street and file it in your local district, federal district court, you would have to file that in the DC District Court. The Judicial Conference of U.S. Courts, which is the national policy-making body for federal courts, back when H.R. 1 was first introduced in 2019, raised objections to this provision. Another provision that the Judicial Conference had concerns with was the aspect of the independent redistricting commissions, which H.R. 1 would have every state establish if they already didn't have one. And one thing that's incredibly interesting in H.R. 1, if for whatever reason the state either fails to create this redistricting commission or they don't create a congressional lines within a certain deadline, the responsibility then falls to a 3-judge panel on the district court or that in that particular state. I think the law says where the state capital is, whatever federal court has the state capital. This just simply defies the Constitution's cases and controversies requirement, where federal courts can't offer advisory opinions. They can't act as a de facto committee to draw congressional lines. I mean, that's one of those just very simple things that would be challenged. This was raised in 2019. Unfortunately, got copy and pasted onto the 2021 version. And then I'll just leave with a final one. And this was in the ethics provision of H.R. 1, which he really didn't touch, but it would mandate a code of ethics for Supreme Court justices. The Supreme Court, unlike any other federal judges, don't have a code of conduct. And so this would create a code of conduct for Supreme Court justices. There's some constitutional controversy if Congress could actually write them for the court, or if the court would have to write them for themselves. But again, it's one of the issues the Judicial Conference flagged when this was first introduced in 2019.
Great. And if I go back to Buzz, actually, since we were just having a conversation about voter ID specifically, I know that Georgia has had voter ID laws on the books for decades. It's been around for a long time for you guys. How does what Georgia does as it relates to voter ID actually work? I mean, you know, we were just talking about a moment ago about a bill in Maine here and how you handle people who don't have IDs and how you actually manage the system to make sure everybody can vote.
Yeah.
And how does Georgia actually approach that issue, and how has it worked over the years?
Yeah. So, Georgia has had voter ID for a long time. It was litigated all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the way Georgia handles it was upheld and found constitutional. So what Georgia does, overwhelmingly most people use their driver's license, but there is a list, I forget how many, but there's a list of other forms of identification that a person can use. Passport is probably a common one, and military ID and tribal IDs and things like that. So there's a pretty good list that covers a wide swath of people that can vote. And then additionally, there's a free state ID card that looks like a driver's license, but it's not it's clear that it's not a driver's license, but it's a state issued ID. And the most common group of people who would probably use this would be elderly folks who no longer drive and thus don't have a driver's license, so they can obtain this for free. There have been secretaries of states in the past who created a bus that drove around the state to neighborhoods where it was thought that there would be people who without IDs and just gave out free state IDs to people. So that's how Georgia attempts to do that, is to provide that free ID and make it as accessible as possible.
Another one that came in here that I want to ask, and this goes back to Anthony. What are some of the free speech and freedom of association concerns as it relates to H.R. 1? Are there things specifically in there that cause you concern?
Yeah, so the couple that concern me the most, essentially what the speech and association aspects of H.R. 1 does is piles on a number of new laws and regulations, primarily looking to nonprofits that work in the policy space. And so one of the biggest organizations that has critiqued this part of the law is actually the ACLU. Back in 2019, again, when H.R. 1 was initially proposed, the ACLU sent out a legal memo really critical of this aspect of the bill. They were really supportive of kind of the election aspects of it. But what this part does essentially is it broadens disclosure requirements and treats nonprofits like they were political campaigns. So if you were to say that, Senator Collins, I don't agree with your vote on Y bill, depending on how that's framed, depending how it's structured, again, the definitions under H.R. 1 are often incredibly broad. that could be treated as your de facto political campaign. So what that does, it has nonprofits would have to disclose their donors. And so that's where you have speech and association right problems. And a lot of this kind of goes back to federal court precedent and talking about kind of famously a Supreme Court case where states in the South tried to access member lists from local NAACP chapters. And the Supreme Court at the time ruled that that anonymous speech was important because this privacy element for First Amendment protections was vital. And this kind of blurs the lines. And the ACLU said themselves that this type of provision would strike the wrong balance between the public's interest in knowing who supports or opposes candidates and vital association rights guaranteed by the First Amendment.
Another one that came in that's directed at you, Bill. So you're back up on the docket.
Yeah, there you go.
It's actually perfect for what you had said before, because you had given us some observations about how you've seen the debate and the conversation evolve over time. You've been involved in this for several decades, so you can definitely speak to this. How has the voting rights versus voting integrity, voting reform, conversation evolved over time? I.e., how has it changed in your observation?
Again, I think it's become much more politically sensitive. It's become much more divisive. It's become much more suspect. And I think this is a spinoff of where we are as a nation now. Again, back several years, or even not that far back, there wouldn't be questioning of administrators, whether they be local clerks or whether they be the Secretary of State or anyone in between. There wouldn't be that kind of automatic questioning or accusing, or if you're one party or the other, you wouldn't be placed so quickly in a box. So I've really seen that change. I've seen that evolve, and it's not been a fun experience to watch, because I think that cuts into all the good discussion that we have. Oftentimes now we don't get to have discussions like this back and forth, because people are too ready to judge someone based on very little, whatever they first look at them or hear what what their party may be, or anything else that may be that simplistic. And I think that really that's been noticeable, and it's been jarring to see where we are now and knowing where we've come from. And so I don't know how we're ever going to change that, but we have to hang in there, because we have to.
Well, I think one of the underlying things that's at work here that might be sort of responsible for that, Bill, is the issue of trust. I don't think there's much trust left from either side about the other side anymore. And as more trust gets eroded, I think that there's more fear of not only the other side, but their motives and what they're actually trying to do when they, propose a change or reform. I think it's true of Republicans about Democrats and Democrats about Republicans. So with that mindfulness to trust, I guess let me ask all three of you, and you can chime in whatever order you want to, but how do you restore trust in the system? I mean, if you were Emperor of the United States and you could just snap your fingers and make some stuff happen that would fill people with a belief in both the integrity of the system and the trustworthiness of the system, but also in the accessibility of the system to make sure that everybody who actually wants to vote can. What would you do? I mean, what would be ultimately your gold standard? I don't know if anybody wants to volunteer to begin here, but have maybe a minute or two each for you guys to answer this one.
I can jump in. I think transparency is important. As much transparency as we can provide to the elections process would be very helpful. I think Senator Diamond probably knows better than I do. I did run for Secretary of State in Georgia in 2018. I was, and I thank God every day I lost. I would have been the subject of presidential tweets, I can tell you. But I think the elections process is much more complicated than people think, and so whatever transparency we can provide to that, and education to help people understand, okay, here's why this is done this way, and the reason it's done is to ensure that your vote is counted and counted accurately. We all just walk in, we cast our ballot, we go home, and we don't really pay it any other mind. But it is a complicated process. So whatever transparency we can provide, I think would be really good.
All right, Anthony or Bill, I don't know if you want to chime in on this one as well.
Yeah, I can go ahead. I think on top of transparency, which is a great answer, I think also this commitment to bipartisan partnerships, in the sense of this commitment from, let's say you have, and I was thinking about this, the recent passing of Walter Mondale, and the graciousness his election was a landslide defeat, and there's great video announcing the results on the floor. And that's the sort of graciousness and sort of partnership where this was a legitimate election. This was done fairly. I lost, but that's the way it goes. I think that sort of partnership and commitment and the ability for people across the aisle to be able to stay together. This is how it works in our country. We may disagree on sometimes the policy, even the elections policies of how it works. We've debated about these things, but again, just coming together for the fundamental commitments of the voters have decided, the process as it's been structured works, and to promote the legitimacy of these elections. I think that sort of just would help to regain a lot of trust that I think tragically we've lost.
Yeah, I just quickly, Matt, I know we're running short, but you know, we have to stop doing things like we've done in Maine, and that is pass a one-party budget, biennial budget. That builds all sorts of distrust, because in order to make our state and our nation better, we have to start trusting each other as lawmakers, as policymakers, and we have to stop doing things just because we can. And that's what we just recently did in Maine, much to my chagrin. So I think we have to start working on ourselves and trust each other more, and not drop to the lowest threshold of what we think we could and should do. I believe we could do it if we would get ourselves back together and stop letting others tell us what we should think.
Well, you got Mike Quattrano's head bobbing up and down, so that must have been true. I totally agree in every way with what you just said, Bill. And unfortunately, that seems like that's the thing that is least interesting to most people in the country right now, is trying to restore that trust and come back together again. So hopefully that changes, because I think we could surely need it. So unfortunately, we're out of time, everyone. So I want to say a quick thank you to our panel, Anthony, Buzz, and Bill, for joining us here to tell us a little bit more about the election systems nationally in Georgia and here in Maine. Been very informative. Obviously, this talk could go on for hours and hours, and I'm sure we would never run out of stuff to talk about. But if you have any additional questions, comments, concerns, or whatnot, please contact us at the Maine Policy Institute. We'd be happy to talk over this with you more. And I do want to make sure before I sign off and end our meeting here today that I do say thank you to everybody who joined us here today, not just for participating and being with us here this afternoon, but also for all you've done to make our work at Maine Policy Institute possible. Really wouldn't be possible without a lot of people on this call. So thank you very much for everything you've done for us and continue to do in the future. Thank you to our panel, and we look forward to talking to you guys all again very soon. See you later.
Thanks.
Well done.